Is 2012 to be a year of strikes and worker protest? Well, there is certainly plenty of discontent to go around. In the UK, unemployment is still rising, incomes are being squeezed and pension provision downsized. My guest today is Mark Serwotka, leader of one of Britain's biggest public sector trades unions. He says the time has come for workers to stand and fight. But in this age of austerity, do unions have the will and the muscle for a prolonged confrontation? Mark Serwotka, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hi.
Do you see 2012 as a year of industrial unrest?
Well, I think that will depend on whether the government carry on making working people, those with the least, pay the biggest price to solve a problem that, of course, we didn't cause. And if we're going to get a continuation of pay restraint, a tax on pensions, hundreds of thousands of job cuts, then I do think 2012 will indeed see a lot of resistance. And I hope that's the case, because we believe that is entirely the wrong way for the government to go.
Well, we're not going to get anything else, are we? I mean, in the current economic circumstance, thinking not just of the UK, but right around the industrialised world, when you talk about pay restraint, job cuts and the other things you mentioned, I mean, inevitably that is going to be the direction of public policy. It has to be, because this is, quote unquote, an age of enforced austerity.
Well, that's the political choices that are being made by governments, including our own.
Well, it's not so much about choice. Isn't that the reality?
Well, we don't think it is the reality, actually. We think that the shame of Britain at the moment is that no politicians are prepared to argue for a very different course. We think that austerity and cuts and a shrinking of the economy is actually the complete wrong way to go. We think that the government's forecasts, for example, which have been wrong on so many levels, but one of the most interesting ones is they've had to borrow £110 billion more than forecast to pay for the cost of rising unemployment. And our philosophy is a bit more simple. It's got to be better for people to be in work, doing something productive, paying tax and national insurance, rather than out of work, claiming welfare and seeing the economy shrink.
All right, well, I will pick away with you at some of that political philosophy in a moment. Before we get there, just in terms of union strategy in the current situation, there's a sense in which I look at what you say about the dispute you've had with government about pensions in particular, which has been running for the last year and more, and I get the sense that you relish confrontation in a certain way. Would you accept that?
No, I think that's often portrayed by people who are looking for some motive rather than the truth, to be honest. I don't relish confrontation. I would much rather have a quiet life, let people get about delivering public services and doing the work that many of our members take such pride in doing. But when the people I represent, some of the lowest paid people in Britain, have had 2 years of a pay freeze, now a tax on their pensions, hundreds of thousands of them lose their jobs, and also their partners and their families are suffering and their communities are suffering, someone has got to stand up and say there is a different route and an alternative. And in that sense, I'm very determined to try to make that case.
Yes, you say somebody's got to stand up, and you always quote your father saying, I think, to paraphrase him, that if you stand and fight, you may not win, but if you don't fight, you'll certainly lose. It's become a bit of a mantra for you. But Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, of course part of the Labour movement of which you're a part, he says, and I'm quoting him, strikes are always the consequence of failure on all sides. Note all sides. And it is a failure that we cannot afford as a nation.
Well, I don't know how many days and years Ed Miliband has spent in his life actually working on low pay and in very difficult conditions. Strikes are the last resort for working people to defend themselves against an attack. Nobody would ever go on strike without good reason. And what Ed Miliband should ask himself is, why did teachers, head teachers, nurses, job centre workers go on strike and lose pay? They did it because after a year of attempting to persuade the government of a different course, the government refused. And then the strike becomes a legitimate weapon of last resort.
Right, but I suppose this is where we get a bit nuanced, because there were strikes last year. In November, there was a big national strike involving many millions of public sector workers across the country, as a result of which the government made a few amendments to its pensions proposal. quite a detailed draft of proposals, but in essence, they modified it a little bit. And most of the public sector unions have now agreed to go back into talks under a set of headings, parameters, which the government has set. Your union has refused. You are the one now which is out in the cold.
Well, what we've done has been consistent. We recognise that millions went on strike because they were being forced to work longer, pay more and get less. Every single person who went on strike, without exception, still faces working longer, paying more and getting less. So the question I pose is this.
Yeah, I know all that, but there's no solidarity anymore. My point is that if you look at the biggest unions, from GMB to Unison, various unions representing healthcare workers and teachers, they've all now agreed to go into talks on the basis of a government offer. You in the PCS, the Public Sector Workers Union, have said no, and you are now out on your own.
Well, what they've actually done is agreed to take that back to their executives. And I hope their executives will ask them the same question I'm asking here. If it was right to go on strike against something 6 weeks ago, why is it now not right to carry on opposing what the government is doing? Now, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge. The executives of these unions may see it very differently. What I know is that we ask people to lose pay and go on strike against something that hasn't altered a jot. And when you say they've accepted heads of agreement...
Many people say it has altered a jot, including leading officials in the Labour Party. Rachel Reeves calls the latest government offer on pensions, quote, a really good step in the right direction, a much better deal for public sector workers.
Well, Danny Alexander told Parliament he'd got everything he wanted without any extra penny, and Francis Maud told the press conference this shows strikes don't work because we've got everything we want. And to be honest, they're right. I don't think anybody should try to pretend things are not what they seem here. Every public sector worker will be asked to work longer, pay thousands of pounds more in and get tens of thousands of pounds less. And on this heads of agreement, let me just say this. They haven't agreed to talk under heads of agreement. What each union was required to do was to sign up to accept those three main principles. And we have said we're not prepared to do that. And the government, therefore, has thrown us out of talks.
So just a final point on this phase of your strategic thinking and going back to your own dad. When it comes to the fight, and he said, your dad always said, if you fight, you have a chance of winning. If you don't fight, you have no chance of winning. Even if all the other unions do go back into talks, agree the heads of agreement and talk on that basis, you are saying you and your nearly 300,000 members will continue strike action through 2012, are you?
Well, I'm saying, first of all, I do not believe for a minute we'll be the only union.
Well, you don't know that, but I'm just asking you whether, even if you're in the end on your own, you are prepared to keep on striking through 2012.
Well, if we're on our own, we will go back and talk to our members about what they are prepared to do. I will recommend to them and to the executive that we refuse to sign away their pensions, that many of them were promised decades ago, and give the government what it wants. But any leader who was to say now, I'm not going to look at the material circumstances and I'm on autopilot, would be doing his members a disservice. But I believe the teachers will reject these heads of agreement. Already, Unite, one of Britain's biggest unions, have rejected it in the civil service. Our colleagues in Northern Ireland have done the same. So we aren't going to be on our own. But ultimately, if something is unfair and unjust, it's equally as unfair and unjust if you're on your own as it is if you're with others.
Yeah, let's talk about fairness and justice. Is it fair and just, in your opinion, that public sector workers get the sort of protected pension that these days, if you look across the private sector, is frankly available to only a tiny, tiny percentage of private sector workers? Is that fair and just in a society where everybody shares certain burdens and certain pains when it comes to difficult economic times?
Well, I think it is fair, and not only do I think it's fair, I would like the same provision to be applied to working people in the private sector.
Yeah, but it's not going to be, is it?
Well, the interesting thing about pensions in Britain is that actually 11% of people in the private sector now have a defined benefit pension scheme. It was 36% only 15 years ago. So the real scandal isn't that the public sector pensions are unfair, it's that private sector employers closed pension schemes, took pensions holidays, while they did very well themselves. And the answer, therefore, can't be equality of misery. It is to try to harmonise upwards people's pensions, both public and private.
Well, you can characterise it any way you want, but the reality is, as you've just explained it, only 1 in 10 private sector workers has a defined benefit final salary, pension, whereas your members, even under the government's modified reform proposals, would all have a form of defined benefit pension. They maintain that. And indeed, if you look at the analysis done by pension experts, they get the sort of pension that in the private sector would require an individual to put 30% or more of their salary into a pension pot. So even after all of these reforms, your members are going to have what can only be regarded as a fabulous pension in broad terms.
Well, the average pension of a PCS member is £4,200 a year. So I think we have to get these figures in context. We are not representing high-paid people on six-figure salaries whose pensions will be locked.
No, I do appreciate that. But the point remains that they get a guaranteed pension linked to their salary, and only a tiny fraction of workers elsewhere in the United Kingdom get that privilege.
Well, they do. But if I accept the logic of what you're putting to me, it is therefore to take the view that you must have a race to the bottom.
But there's not a race to the bottom.
Well, it is a race to the bottom.
Your members aren't being taken to the bottom.
Well, they are being taken far, far further down to the bottom than they are at the moment.
No, with respect, they're not.
No,
what they're being asked to do is work a little bit longer. They're being asked to contribute a little bit more, but it has to be said that the lowest paid are not being asked to contribute more. And frankly, any independent analysis I've seen suggests that it remains an outstandingly good deal in the context of what people get on similar salaries in the private sector.
Well, they're being asked to work substantially more, in some cases 8 years more. They're being asked to pay thousands of pounds more in, when many of them have had a 2-year pay freeze. And they stand to get tens of thousands of pounds less. And where I think this conversation isn't quite at the right point is this. I don't start with everybody else has less, so we must get less. I start from what have you got at the moment? What does your contract tell you? What were you promised and why were you promised it? So, for example, in the civil service, the pensions we get take account, independent reports tell us, of the fact that we have an 8% pension contribution, in effect, that our pay has been abated for comparable jobs elsewhere in the public and private sector. So these things didn't sort of materialise last year. They historically are where they are because our overall package of pay and pensions, in comparison with the private sector, was broadly seen to be the same.
I come back to this word justice. There's a fundamental question, and it's this one. Who ultimately guarantees and bankrolls the pensions of public sector workers?
The taxpayer.
Exactly. The taxpayer, most of whom could not dream of having the pension guarantees that your members have. And is it tenable in the long run, looking ahead 10, 20, 30 years, that these taxpayers, and you've just said their pensions are getting worse and worse and worse, these taxpayers are going to continue to tolerate paying their taxes for the sort of completely ring-fenced, protected pensions that you seem to imagine?
Well, let's be clear, in the private sector we've already seen the beginnings of resistance over attacks on private sector pensions. We had a strike in Unilever just before Christmas. Ballots in other places have begun. But the answer I would give there is, if every taxpayer could pick and choose where every penny went, none of mine would go towards nuclear weapons, mine wouldn't go towards illegal wars, and mine certainly wouldn't go to subsidise massive tax relief, which actually costs more tax relief for pensions in the private sector than we pay on public sector pensions. The difference is that tax relief almost exclusively benefits the richest and best off. So what I'm standing for here is actually the working people, and the divide isn't public-private, it's the haves and the have-nots. And I'm trying to articulate the have-nots, both public and private, deserve not to pay such a massive price for something they did nothing to cause.
I'm sure